Evening, kapow, kaboom, we're back. Different time, different day. So thank you for finding us for this week's episode of Live with Littlewood. With me, Mark Littlewood, the Director General of the Institute of Economic Affairs. Slightly shorter programme this week, but we've got one hell of a lot to pack into the next 75 minutes. Might be a different time and a different day, but many of the same issues we're returning to. And as usual, we've got a brilliant lineup of politicians, commentators, journalists, think tankers and the like to help navigate our way through the many crises the country's facing. Coming up on tonight's show, shooting the messenger. Should journalists, podcasters and presenters be held responsible for outrageous remarks made by their own guests? Campaigner Darren Grimes faces a Met Police investigation, an interview under caution for stirring up racial hatred for his decision to publish an interview with now disgraced historian David Starkey. If prosecuted, Darren could face a maximum of 7 years in prison. What sort of overzealous policing is this? What sort of law is this? Surely this is a pretty serious threat to freedom of speech. And is it actually going to have a chilling effect on legitimate journalistic practices? Of course, we at the IEA are mainly interested in economic issues. But if people can't speak freely and exchange opinions, free markets become pretty difficult to operate. Coming up later, sage advice. It's emerged this week that the government ignored advice from experts to implement a so-called circuit breaker lockdown back in September. Prime Minister Boris Johnson now seems to be under fire from all quarters for doing too little too late, for not doing enough, for jeopardising the economy, for doing too much. Is it all going to end in tears? It looks like it's actually going to end in 3 different tiers for different parts of the country. Coming up later on the show, closing time. Pubs, restaurants, casinos, betting shops, gyms, football clubs and more are obviously all suffering severe problems caused by the coronavirus restrictions and the lockdowns. Some will undoubtedly be closing their doors for the final time. What's the long-run economic effect going to be of the lockdown and controls that we got in place? And just how deep will the economic scars run? And then we're going to wrap up tonight's show by talking about the lost generation. Interesting stuff, this. New figures from the Office for National Statistics show that young white people in Britain now earn less than their ethnic minority counterparts. The stats show that the ethnicity pay gaps vanished for those who began their careers over the past 15 years. Will young white working class people now be the left behind? All of that and more to come. And as I've said, we've got a stellar lineup of guests to help us navigate these issues. Coming up later on the show, I'll be joined by my good friend Andrew Allison. He's the head of campaigns at the Freedom Association. He's also previously been the national grassroots coordinator at the Taxpayers Alliance. Prior to becoming a full-time political campaigner, he ran his own driving school business for over 10 years. So he should be able to give us a clear steer tonight and perhaps explain some of the government's handbrake turns. We're also going to be joined by the newly decorated and ermined Baroness Fox of Buckley, or as you might better know her, Claire Fox, founder and director of the Academy of Ideas. It will also be a welcome back to the show to journalist Benedict Spence. Benedict writes regularly for the Telegraph and the Independent, covers everything from domestic and European politics to culture and sport, and you can see him regularly on Sky News on the Paper Review. Mahyar Tousi will also be making a return appearance on the show. He describes himself as a classical, liberal, conservative YouTuber with a mission to protect freedom, democracy and capitalism. And he seems to be doing a pretty good job of it. His YouTube channel regularly attracts tens of thousands of viewers, has a massive 188,000 subscribers. So subscribe to his channel and make sure you subscribe to ours if you haven't already. From the home team, it's a welcome back to the show to the IEA's very own head of lifestyle economics, Chris Snowdon. scourge of the nanny state, prolific writer whose work focuses on, in Chris's words, pleasure, prohibition, and dodgy statistics. And it's always great to have him with the show, although he's probably the most miserable guest we always have on the show and the most pessimistic. That's all coming up later, but joining me straight up, it's a great pleasure to welcome onto the programme Ben Bradley. Good evening, Ben.
Hi, Mike. How are you?
I'm very good. Ben is the Conservative MP for Mansfield in Nottinghamshire, first elected at the 2017 general election. Well, I guess the first bricks in the Red Wall were beginning to crumble back then, right, Ben?
Yeah, some say the first brick in the Red Wall, but I don't like to talk about it, Mark.
You don't like to talk about it. You don't, even though, of course, in the last election, you saw your majority go up about tenfold, I think, in percentage terms.
16-fold, thanks.
16-fold. I'm sorry, blimey, Struth. I would have expected you to have committed that to memory. You're also the chairman of Blue Collar Conservatives, Ben, and a kind of new breed of Conservative representing a seat which, until you won it with under the blue colours, had been red for many, many generations. And I want to ask you, because you've been outspoken on this Darren Grimes issue, what on earth is going on here? What's your take of this, that somebody produces a show, one of their guests says something that is racist, inappropriate, although I don't think it was an incitement to violence, just, crude and unfortunate language. And the presenter of that programme, who I think the worst that you could criticise him for was not being sharp enough as a journalist, is going to be interviewed under caution for the Met Police. I thought the police had rather stretched resources and were finding it hard to fight crime. What do you make of this, Ben? What on earth is going on here?
It's such a madness. I mean, 3-4 people have been murdered in London in the last 24, 48 hours, and the police are spending resources on Darren, of all people. As you say, might be guilty perhaps of a kind of journalistic naivety, and a level of Mr. Starkey is, or formerly was, a very kind of revered historian, and there'd be a level of, young man interviewing him not wanting to question or to come back to him. Maybe there's a power thing there a little bit, but the idea that it's a criminal offence, frankly, even, what David said is, as you say, unfortunate language, and I wouldn't agree with it, but even that in itself, saying it shouldn't be a criminal offence. We have freedom of speech. But the implications for journalists, if you have to be able to predict when you edit what might possibly cause offence in the future, and if you get it wrong and fail to edit it, that could be a criminal offence. That's really, potentially a huge issue.
Do you think there's prejudice involved here? Because, I'm trying to work out. Do you remember back in the day, there was a lot of controversy when Question Time invited Nick Griffin, then leader of the BNP, onto the panel, which I thought was an absolutely brilliant idea because it exposed what a complete idiot he was. But nevertheless, it was a controversial idea. Well, in today's world, would the editor of Question Time be hauled over the coals and interviewed by the police for putting a racist on the panel if Nick Griffin said something racist? Is that the way we're going?
Well, maybe so. I mean, you're right. The way to dispel these philosophies and things that aren't right, that are racist or whatever, is to hear them and to be able to point out all the things that are wrong with them. Otherwise, it builds more of a following. And we found with other, pretty untoward characters that the more you block them and the more you push them out of the kind of limelight, the more of a following they tend to amass. So I don't think it's a healthy thing. The way is to pick those arguments apart and to have them in as part of the public discourse. Nick Griffin going on Question Time was the end of the BNP in many ways, or the start of the end.
Yeah. But Ben, I'm trying to work out who's to blame here, right? I mean, is this the fault of the Met Police? I've got some statistics here. This is going back a few years, but in 2015 to 2016, 30 police forces dealt with apparently 11,236 hate incidents, the equivalent of one every half hour. Spending just an hour on each case would take a single police officer 5 years and 7 months to complete. Crazy investigations include a pastor in Norfolk being investigated for putting up a poster implying that non-Christians would go to hell. That's apparently a hate crime, right? Now, is the problem here the cops? Is it that they're overzealous or, have become completely woke? Or is the problem your profession, Ben, that the Parliament has passed all of these rules and laws? It's the job of the police to carry them out. So if you guys are passing, hate and incitement crime legislation, when the Met Police get a complaint, whether that complaint was genuine or motivated for political reasons, they're, I guess, duty bound to investigate it, right?
I think it's a combination of all of the above, to be honest. And you have a scenario where we have legislation, some of it old legislation, so Public Order Act, right, in terms of Darren, is from the 80s, but it's not caught up with the modern world. So as technology develops, as conversations develop, previously you said something offensive, and the people who were offended were far away and weren't going to react to it and weren't going to be able to come back on it, and that's not the case anymore. I think there's a job for us as legislators to fix some of those gaps, and to draw the kind of ring more tightly around the police in terms of what they're able to investigate, because it's pretty clear this is a massive waste of time and money, even beyond the implications in terms of free speech. There's also a policing thing, right? And rightly or wrongly, I'm sure you have a view, I certainly do, but a lot of those powers in terms of the operational bits are devolved down to police and crime commissioners, in the Met's case, the mayor. So you get a woke mayor, you get a woke police force.
Okay, and do you think that we've had Toby Young and Lawrence Fox and various others discussing these sort of general free speech issues? Do you have in your mind, Ben, a way that we could effectively define the parameters for freedom of speech? So sort of incitement to actually riot, for example, would likely get you arrested. We wouldn't just say, well, that's fair enough. If people then choose to riot, we're not going to arrest the speaker. But it seems to me that the goalposts haven't so much moved; they've just widened. We've just now included it to be anything that might offend someone, even if it wouldn't cause any harm beyond offence. I can't see anything in the Starkey Grimes interview that could have caused material harm to somebody. I can imagine somebody watching it and being offended, but heck, I get offended, 20 times a day by things. I don't expect the people offending me to get arrested or to be interviewed under caution for it. But do you think we're able to actually draw a line in the sand somewhere, which is like, well, this is incitement to riot or incitement to murder somebody, but this is just controversial, unpopular, possibly even racist opinion? Because that's what's shifted, isn't it?
I think you're right, and the truth of the matter is we're going to have to draw that line, aren't we? Because it can't carry on as it is. I mean, you could pick out countless examples. The Kill Whitey thing on the BBC the other week, where that has come out. It's been clearly gone through producers and editors who haven't predicted the offence or have left it in. How's that different to Darren? So there are countless examples where we can't just allow being offended to warrant a criminal offence. We've now got this madness going even beyond that is non-criminal hate incidents or non-crime hate incidents. So police can report and log things against a person that's not even a crime, just because somebody's rung the police and said, I've been offended by something. And that is just an utter nonsense. So I think we're going to have to draw the line tightly. For me, it is exactly what you said. It's does this actually incite some kind of harm, some kind of violence? Because it may be an unpopular opinion these days, but in terms of just being offended, frankly, people are going to have to suck it up, because that's what free society is.
But how on earth did we get here? I mean, if you report something to the police that isn't a crime, why don't they just hang up on you? I mean, what else can you report to the police? I might need a bit of plumbing done. There might be a leak in my roof. The missus might have sworn at me. My toaster might be broken. I mean, they just tell me to go away. Why don't they just hang up at the other end of the phone?
And we've got there's been that societal shift, hasn't there? I think not helped by some of the legislation around hate crimes and all that kind of stuff. That there's a lot of that misogyny is a hate crime in Nottinghamshire, where I'm from. And if you wolf whistle a lady in the street, that's a crime. Used to just be a bit offensive, but that's now a criminal offence. There are problems like that where we have created legislation that is entirely unhelpful, where the police now feel they have to investigate this stuff. Previously, they might have told you to get lost and stop wasting their time. Governments are to blame for that, and we need to start to redraw those lines. There's also a level of societal pressure, right? If you're the police, I mean, they've been handing out leaflets outside Westminster Station today, calling for people to report hate crimes and all the rest of it. We've seen the Met taking the knee in the BLM process. A lot of that has to come from just societal pressure as to them getting attacked, either personally, physically, or on social media, as to not engaging with these things. And society's got a lot to answer for in itself.
So, give me a sense of what the feeling is in Parliament about this, Ben. Is there going to be change brought about by you and your colleagues? Obviously, the Conservatives have got a majority. I mean, might there even be a cross-party move to change this? I must admit, I was going to say a bit concerned. Indeed, I was mortally offended when I saw the Labour Party MP Cole Turner, who I think is their shadow on legal aid. He tweeted, freedom of speech, Darren, doesn't afford people the freedom to make racist remarks or generally offend. I mean, this is just unbelievable. And I mean, is this? I'd rather this wasn't a partisan issue, that we could get agreement across the aisle that actually freedom to offend is endemic to freedom of expression. And the minute you actually put offence above freedom of speech, you got a real problem. But is there actually going to be, other than people sort of publicly intervening like yourself, Ben, do you think there could be any change in practice or to the law here, or is there not the political will in Parliament to touch this? It's too, it would be seen as too anti-PC to do so.
If you're mortally offended, Mark, firstly you should report that to the police, because that's very important that we get some equality in that. No, I think there is. Look, and we've got you mentioned earlier on in the introduction around the kind of the blue wall, the change in the Parliamentary Conservative Party. There are a lot more people from a lot more communities like mine around this country who think this is all a load of woke PC nonsense. That's the prevailing view in my constituency, and there are a lot more colleagues with that view. We also have a Home Secretary who is bound by the the norms and the things that Home Secretaries do and say, but actually, as you can imagine, probably has a very strong view on this. I spoke to her yesterday. Just a very strong view on this, and there is a lot of Home Office legislation going through the House in the next few months that I hope has an impact on some of this. So I think there'll be real action on it.
Well, that will change police. I mean, that will nudge police in the direction of actually, investigating rape, murder, and armed robbery, rather than people phoning up to say, "I want to report a non-crime hate incident. Somebody's pissed me off at work," or whatever. Right?
Equally important. Equally, no. So I think there's an awful lot going on in the Home Office, as you can imagine, around all sorts of issues, immigration, and things that are very top of the public kind of agenda. But top on law and order was one of our manifesto messages as well, and it's certainly something that there's every political incentive for constituencies like mine to deliver on. It's an expectation that we sort that out and make sure the police are dealing with crimes, because the frustration for our residents, right, is that they see on Twitter somebody's been investigated for being rude to somebody, whilst the police haven't got the resources to attend the burglary or the kids fighting outside their front door. So we've got to get that right. And I find beyond residents, actually a lot of frontline police officers are pretty frustrated with some of the bosses as well. So there's a real incentive to sort it out.
Right, let's get somebody else's take on this. I fear we might all just be thoroughly agreeing with each other for the next few minutes, but it's great to have Claire Fox back on the show. I'm not sure I can call her Claire Fox anymore. I need to call her her ladyship or some such like. Now she is actually Baroness Fox of Buckley. Claire, the director and the founder of the Institute of Ideas. Claire, great to have you back with us. Good evening, your ladyship. Good evening, and congratulations on your elevation to the heights of the political establishment, Claire.
Thank you. I know I'm just going to be taking the mickey out of on this one, but anyway, I stand here as a Democrat despite everything.
Good, excellent. And what's you might have heard Ben and I talking about this Darren Grimes issue. Darren, of course, previously of this parish, but we seem to have a young chap here who's got controversial opinions. Some of the opinions, I guess, might even offend some people, but he's in his mid to late 20s. He seems to be spending most of his life fighting off the authorities for expressing an opinion, or, lo and behold, even allowing somebody else to express an opinion in the case of Starkey. What do you make of it, Claire?
Well, I think that it was interesting that there was quite a lot of people who would not generally be Darren Grimes supporters, who, in a general sense, who did realise that the consequence of this for journalism, and they were at great pains to point out that Darren isn't a journalist. I mean, that was kind of a sectarian dig that they had. But the consequences for journalism would be absolutely incredible. Dangerous, of course, if you are held responsible. So, Mark, you would be held responsible for anything I might be about to say. And you don't know what I'm going to say before I've said it. So how can that happen? And that would be a situation that would effectively stop press freedom. So that's the first thing to say. But I was listening in to what you were talking about, and I think that one of the things that's happened is, apart from the fact that offence has expanded, I mean, I wrote a book a few years ago called I Find That Offensive on that very point, but things have become much worse because I think the expansion of the definition of incitement has also not helped. So what incitement means is not the very narrow way that you described it, Mark, but it's almost incitement to hate, if you know what I mean. So that's anything and everything. And the other problem we face is, what does harm mean anymore? Again, the harm principle, which J.S. Mill referred to, would be a physical consequence. But of course, harm has now been treated with this elastic concept that's ever growing, which is psychological harm, trauma, damage. And of course, anyone can claim that then. And we know that that's in fact what happens, is when people say, I was genuinely harmed by this, they sort of mean it. And that definition is now taken as read. But where I was a little, just so that we don't all agree with each other, I'm less confident in the Conservative administration dealing with this, it has to be said. I'm afraid that there's a number of reasons why not. I mean, on the one hand, I think that, and this is a warning to people who are pro-free speech, anti-woke, I hate that expression, but which is there's far too much tit for tat going on. You know what I mean? So what you get is you get people who say, haha, we're going to try and silence somebody from Novara Media or somebody in the Labour Party, i.e. to use the same tactics. And I understand the frustration of feeling that you're always on the losing side, or always the ones that have been cancelled. But on the other hand, don't let's lower, the public debate by kind of saying we as free speechers would use it and deploy the same silencing techniques. And the second thing is that I'm afraid that the Conservative Party's approach to this has not been very loud. There hasn't been much leadership. I don't just want legislation, because I think it is a cultural question. And I think there could just be much more of an attempt at constantly pointing out that free speech is a foundational value. And I'm here in my hotel, my ever glamorous hotel room in Euston, and staying in a travel lodge. I've just rushed from the Lords to this. And in a debate about coronavirus, I'm afraid many of the people from the Conservative side were effectively saying that anyone who dissents on coronavirus is some kind of a flat earther. Well, that is a silencing technique. It's a way of delegitimizing people. And that broader cultural point is, that there's an orthodoxy, and if you don't go along with it, you are beyond the fringes of acceptable society, and that scares the hell out of me.
No, I've got some sympathy with you there, Claire, that it's not entirely a matter of what's written in the law. It's also a matter of social convention and practice. And even if the law says you've got freedom of speech, if there's only a handful of people who stand up for that or advocate it, it's likely to wither on the vine. But is there any legal change you think we should make? I mean, do you think that we have allowed the law to move from, incitement to violence to then having hate crimes and then incitement to hatred? And what you were saying about the J.S. Mill principle, harm now seems to include as a subset offending someone. If I offend you, I've harmed you, and therefore I don't have freedom of speech. You know what I mean? The goalposts have just widened and widened and widened. Do you think there is some way we could get that back legally, notwithstanding that that's not the entire battle won in itself, that people need to keep reiterating the need for freedom of expression?
Well, I would definitely look at all of the hate crime legislation, because I think that's become completely untenable in terms of living in a free society. That's one of the ways that we are being criminal, speech is being criminalized. But as we speak, there is legislation in the offing, the Online Harms Bill. Now, this is, it's not Ben's fault, but I'm just saying, a new piece of legislation. I'm going to bring him in a minute. Exactly. Yeah. Is a new piece of legislation being put forward by the Conservative Party with a huge majority by the government. And that Online Harms Bill is going to do enormous harm to free speech and free expression. And of course, a lot of these egregious complaints of offence happen via the medium of online these days. And the Online Harms Bill, I mean, draconian isn't in it really. And, all this attempt at saying we're just trying to protect people, actually what will happen is that you're just going to silence people. And the greatest fear I have, I suppose, is a climate of self-censorship, because what we've got is people not prepared to say what they believe, not able to say what they believe in good conscience. Even just the very nature of democracy surely is that you experiment with ideas and you think out loud. You don't always have a pre-prepared script. You're trying to see what you think about an issue. And if you try and do that on social media, the Online Harm Bill are going to come along and criminalize you. And there'll be many more examples of Darren Grimes. I mean, he might be a high-profile person. He actually has, and I'm glad about this, got a lot of publicity for what he said. But there's an awful lot of kind of Joe Bloggses, Susan Smiths around the place who are actually being warned by the police, silenced, scared, and now a new piece of high-profile legislation is actually going to threaten them and their livelihoods.
Ben, let me come back to you then. There's a bit of a challenge to you. I mean, firstly, Claire's point about it being somewhat partial. You're the chair of blue collar conservatives and a Brexiteer. Darren's a working class Brexiteer. Is that everybody's defending their own rather than the wider principle? And what about this online harms bill? Is there a danger the government is, even if it's got people like you on the back benches trying to hold them to some semblance of freedom of speech prevailing, that actually, whatever the Home Secretary might think and whatever she says, we're rushing through all this stuff, which is going to make this worse in future, not better, aren't we?
Well, I certainly agree with Claire that there's a public discourse challenge here as well as there is a legislative one. I'm more confident with some of the things we've said around legislation around tying in the police a little bit more and narrowing those windows to do some of this stuff than I am about what she said about the general atmosphere and people standing up for this. I think there's a significant group within the Conservative Party who are going to ministers and going to government and saying, look, this kind of culture war, to put it in that language, is raging on around you, and you need either engage in it or not. But if you don't, people are going to come and asking why you're not and why you don't believe in this stuff. So that battle is going on internally, I can assure you. And we do need to do that. We do need to stand up for freedoms and free speech, which, again, mentioned COVID is usually more challenging perhaps than normal at the minute for a variety of reasons. So it's a conversation that's happening, and the Conservative Party, the broad church is a phrase that's often used, someone more conservative than others, shall we say. But it's happening. And in terms of online harms, I share the same concern. In fact, I raised it with the Home Secretary yesterday. And there's one thing, trying to curb some of the power and the direction that some of these social media companies have, because they do wield an awful lot of influence. If you, I think it's Douglas Murray's book that shows that, and I checked this the other day because I'm reading it, where if you Google straight couples, you get lots of pictures of gay couples, and if you Google gay couples, you don't get pictures of straight couples. They kind of are social engineering in many ways, some of these companies, and there's a level of work that needs to be done to prevent that and balance things up. But I am very, very conscious of the restrictions and just expanding those kind of dodgy hate crime laws out onto a internet platform.
Right. Well, I want to, before I let you go, Ben, I want to move the discussion onto coronavirus. Sage advice, we're calling it. Sage members say full 2-week lockdown from October the 24th. Stay-at-home orders, possibly school closures, could reduce deaths for the rest of this year from about 19,900 to 12,100. Very, very precise. They know exactly who's going to die or not. Hospital admissions might be halved. Is this what we're moving to, that the second wave is hitting us? The scientists are in charge. They've got their spreadsheets and their numbers. They obviously know more about epidemiology than I do. But look, I'm feeling a bit left out here. I've spent most of my professional life going around saying controversial and things that sometimes offend people. Nobody's ever arrested me. Let's see if we can put that right in this next segment. Ben, what's your view of these lockdowns and this tiering system and the confusion about the rules? I've got on my notes here, you say you're disappointed that the whole of Nottinghamshire is in tier 2 rather than just the city of Nottingham, unable to differentiate between Nottinghamshire and the city, not helped by local Labour councils actively calling for more restrictions. Ben, what's your guidance, insistence on the government in terms of imposing these rules to try and stop the spread of this virus? And how long is this going to go on for?
The answer to that last bit, God knows, is the truth. I think my starting point is that restrictions should be a last resort, and I think there's an element of some people having forgotten that in the course of all of this. But which was my argument in Nottinghamshire. Our rates in Mansfield are 10% of those in Nottingham City, but because we're in the same county, they've lumped us all in together, even though we're 20 miles away. And the impact of those restrictions on things like mental health, we've got high levels of domestic violence, we've got all sorts of social problems that are only going to be made worse by social restrictions. So that's been my argument. The challenge, I suppose, we keep seeing all these polls that say public want restrictions and public one lockdown. I'm not convinced that these things are properly aired and explained. The idea, and I think there's a perception that Keir Starmer's suggestion around a 2-week, whatever they want to call it, circuit break now or short intermission, will be the end, but it won't. We'll just be back in the same position in a month's time. So I think there needs to be more openness about it, and I think we need to get back to a position where restrictions are a last resort rather than a first step. I know most of the constituents I speak to are not representative of those polls that say give us more lockdown, please.
But the other thing, Ben, and I'm going to ask Claire's views on this before I bring in our next two guests. How much of this, and I know it sounds ridiculous to suggest it in the context of a pandemic, which is obviously an other regarding thing, but how much of this do you think, Ben, could just be done voluntarily? If you're 75 or 80 and obese and have got diabetes, well, it's probably very sensible for you to isolate or, minimize social contact for the time being. If you're 25, have no underlying conditions, never spend a minute of your time in the company of anybody over the age of 50, you can surely go about your ordinary business. Now, I appreciate you might have to bring in restrictions about young, healthy people who, say, work in care homes. But it seems that we've just got equal misery here. And now that the data's coming in more and more each day about the impact of this disease, this coronavirus does discriminate, right? Clearly discriminates on the grounds of age. I think men are more susceptible than women. You can look at the stats and you can make your own decisions about the extent to which you wish to minimize your potential exposure until a vaccine comes along. It's not obvious to me that you really need much. You might need government guidance, advertisements and helplines so people can get to the bottom of the facts. But it seems to me a good bunch of the population, a majority of the population, principally those of working age, could now go about their business in the normal way, where they will be exposing themselves to a risk of getting an extremely nasty bug, but probably not enormously worse than getting a bad bout of flu. Can't we just now let people make up their own mind? Isolate if you want, or if you feel you have to. Otherwise, go about your normal business.
I think we're going to have to get to that point, aren't we? There's a question about when. I think ideologically, I start from exactly the same place as you've just laid out. The challenge, I suppose, and the caveat as a member of parliament is that I see both the people who've carried on as normal throughout, have been at work, kids have been at school, like, my family have been in that situation, versus those people who've been locked away basically since March and are still afraid to come out. And unfortunately, we did a very good job as a government of scaring people to death back at the beginning. So I do see that, if you just opened everything up, there will be people who are isolated just out of fear, never mind out of kind of all of the logical reasons that you laid out. So there's a duty to kind of act and to do something. I think if we get to the point where, come Christmas, this vaccine isn't imminently in the offing, then we're going to have a big rethink and start to look at the personal responsibility element much more closely.
And do you think, Ben, just before I say goodbye to you and bring in our other guests, and Claire, stay with us, do you think, Ben, we're putting, the government seems to be one-eyed on this, really, that the protecting people from COVID-19 seems to be the absolute ace of trumps above everything else. And I know there are difficult trade-offs between economic health and physical health, but even on physical health now, the backlog of things like breast cancer checks and God knows what else are going to lead to terrible health outcomes, let alone the deterioration in the economy. You can look at any model you want. If you start wiping off substantial amounts of GDP, you get mental health problems, physical health problems. It's not good for your health to lose your job and to be made redundant. And in all other areas of the National Health Service, it seems we're going backwards, right? Cancer checks aren't happening. Many people may die because so much priority is being put on COVID. Do you think we've kind of got this now sort of obsession of all of the eggs are in the COVID basket? We've got to stop the spread of this illness or people dying from this at the expense of absolutely everything else. Breast cancer checks, the state of the economy. Surely COVID now is one thing we need to put into the round, not an overarching national emergency, which will cause health and economic damage if you over-egg that particular pudding.
Feels a bit that way, doesn't it? I think, as I say, inevitably we're going to have to come to some balance in the future where we live with it, and you can see why and understand why government is more risk averse perhaps than most of the population is. One way or the other, can't do right for doing wrong. and ultimately you're going to get blamed for every death that does occur. So you can see why they are risk averse, but we will inevitably have to move to a situation like we did with flu and like we do with all sorts of other diseases, where you basically have to say, to put it bluntly, what is an acceptable level of people dying of this, which is a really difficult judgment and thing for a government to say, isn't it? Because you open yourself up to all sorts of allegations when you have to make that decision. But ultimately, to get back to a life that's something like normal, something like acceptable levels of living, we're going to have to get to a stage where we balance it much better in the future.
Yeah, I can see it's going up, but I think I'm right in saying that my data will be about a week out of date, I think. But it's the 27th most common cause of death in Britain, dying of COVID-19, 27th, and is causing, was about a week ago, was causing about 1% of all deaths in Britain. I mean, terrible for those it's afflicting, of course, but doesn't seem to be necessarily the greatest affliction, even from a health perspective, at least at the moment, on present rates of infection. Ben, it's been great having you with us. Thank you very much for joining us. Always good to hear from you. Keep fighting the good fight. Make sure the government acts in a more sensible and wise way, and I'm sure that you'll continue to insist they listen to your wise words as a representative of Mansfield. Been lovely having you with us, Ben. Thanks so much. Enjoy the rest of your evening.
You too. I'll see you soon.
See you soon, Ben. Great pleasure to welcome onto the show now Andrew Allison, first time on the show, head of campaigns at the Freedom Association, previously the National Grassroots Coordinator for the Taxpayers Alliance, around the corner, and Mahyar Tousi, the classical liberal conservative YouTuber, Union Jacks, both in the background. This is going to get me nicked, guys. I'm as good as arrested. I won't survive this. My career's in tatters because of the flag on your wall. Thanks very much for joining us. Let me just bring back in Claire Fox, if she's still with us, to ask her thoughts on the way we're handling these restrictions. Claire, has this got out of control? I started being, even as a pretty much straight down the line libertarian, sympathetic to the government, that this could be the sort of circumstance in which the state should act. A pandemic, it's a kind of public good problem. If we need to put our lives on hold for a few weeks in order to try and make sure, that the health service isn't overwhelmed. I had some basic sympathy with that, even though it goes against the grain of my principles. Now I've lost all patience with it. This has become an overreaction to something that is an enormous problem, but I suspect we're now doing more harm than good, both to health and to wealth, through the state response. Claire, where are you at as a freedom-loving politician and public intellectual on this?
Well, I mean, I agree with you that at the start of this, there was a sense that we had to treat an unknown pandemic as we might the plague and not play, silly buggers about being libertarian at the expense of being sensible. I mean, it was just straightforward. And I started to get worried when those people who asked questions started to be demonized. So going back to our free speech thing, I wasn't even that skeptical. I was happy to go along with it. But I thought when they started to demonize or started saying you can't say that type of thing, and we had everything from the government actually asking the big tech companies to censor certain ideas, and scientists suddenly their YouTube videos disappearing. That kind of thing started to make me anxious. The fact that they didn't put in a sunset clause to the coronavirus bill in the first place, and were kind of like appalled that anyone should ask them when it was draconian legislation, which you could say, all right, emergency powers, I'll live with it. But then why didn't you want us to come back and be accountable for that? But I think so. Yes, I'm with you on the fact that I was not a kind of hardline anti-lockdowner, but I bought and was convinced by, okay, we'll do this. We'll have a look at this. But we now know a huge amount more. I mean, I think maybe you underestimate the seriousness of the virus myself a little in the way you talked, but it's also not the plague. We also now understand a lot better how to treat it. The people who are contracting, getting coronavirus and even being hospitalized at the moment are not, thankfully, having as high a mortality rate as they did, because we didn't know how to do with it. There's a lot more people that we know are catching it and are not even being hospitalized. A lot of them are asymptomatic or poorly, and it's not very nice, but they're okay. But the most important thing is the point that you made about the reorganization of the whole of society around COVID distorts priorities and means that you cannot see anything other than the logic of dealing with this one virus. And I mean, the costs are going to be enormous socially. It's not just, people talk about economic costs, but it's social costs that include economic costs, i.e. the destruction of society as we know it. I don't know who that is or if it's me. Is it me? I don't know. I'll carry on.
Yeah, carry on.
One thing that Ben said was he talked about the polls. I mean, I've talked to a few people about this. I'm not convinced that the majority of people agree with me about wanting to have a return to the new normal, a return to normal and not the new normal as quickly as possible. And I think risk aversion has got so carried away with itself, and the government is so worst case scenario building, and because they take their lead from scientists rather than having a broader view. I think we're in serious danger here. But the main thing is that but I do know that lots of people don't agree with me. And I mean, and I don't. But the thing I was going to say was, none of us know what the public mood is. It's hard to read the public mood as a politician at the best of times. But there is no public mood at the moment because we're all atomized. We're all stuck at home. So the concept of a public square in which you go out and you meet your mates, you have a chat, you're a bit scared, but then they reassure you, or the other way around, actually. So what do these polls mean? They are just not reflective of the real mood. And I'm afraid that you've got a government that's running scared from a Labour Party in opposition who are more risk averse, more lockdown enthusiastic than anything else. And they're reacting to that. And then they're reacting to these polls. And what they're not doing is and they're reacting to the sage crowd. What they're not doing is taking a step back and saying, for example, right, we want to get society back to normal as quickly as possible. Now, what must we do to do that? They're actually short-term delaying everything so that they don't have to face the consequence of what they will have to face, which is the reckoning will happen. And that reckoning is not going to be kind to them, I think.
Let me bring in Mahyar. I'll come to you in a minute. Not only you got a Union Jack behind you, you sounded like you were revving up your chainsaw as well. But let me bring in Andrew first. Andrew, your perspective from the Freedom Association sort of point of view, where do you think we've got to on these lockdowns now? Tough, it's always a tough sort of concept for people of a kind of libertarian mindset, that this is something that on the face of it requires collective action, right? Because your activities are other regarding and potentially fatal. And to Claire's point, I agree. It's not just a question of, how many people does it kill? It does seem to be a pretty grim disease to get, even if you survive it, with potentially long-term implications. But where do you see we are now, Andrew, and what's the way out of this and back to normal? I don't want the new normal. I just want normal.
Yeah, I very much want the old normal back again. I think if you view this through a COVID lens, and that is it, then you're going to be in favour of more restrictions because you're terrified that you're going to die. There are people that say that you have to put lives above the economy, but of course, without an economy, people don't really have very, very pleasant lives. They don't have enough money to put a roof over their heads, to feed and clothe their kids, to put food on the table. So you have to look at this in the round. And I feel that the government is simply not doing that. They just get terrified by all the statistics. I mean, it's taken the government long enough to really start focusing in on those people who are being hospitalized, going onto intensive care wards and looking at the death figures. But I mean, until recently, the only thing they were talking about was the number of cases. And as we know, you can be asymptomatic. In fact, COVID, the younger you are, it's no worse than the common cold. In fact, it could be even better than the common cold because you don't even realize that you've got it. But of course, if you happen to be in your 80s or 90s and you've got a number of underlying health conditions, it's the equivalent of having pneumonia. So there has to be a way forward of allowing people to lead their lives, go about their normal business, and shielding the vulnerable. It was interesting. Allison Pearson, in a column in the Telegraph this week, said for the 12 billion quid that Dido Harding's being given for the test and trace scheme, you could have actually given £60,000 to every person who was living by themselves, who were vulnerable, and sent them off to Shield in the Bahamas. Mm-hmm. So this is the sort of money that we're spending all over this, and it seems to be money down the drain.
Mahyar, what's your take on this? You're a classical liberal conservative. You're a libertarian-leaning person. Were you sceptical from the outset? I can't recall. Or what do you think we should do now? Should we just pull a lever and get back to normal, or is that practically impossible?
I mean, that's the thing. So, well, firstly, thanks for having me. As a libertarian, initially there were a lot of people who picked sides and made it political. I know, like, for example, a good friend of mine, Ryan Bourne, as a libertarian, he went completely with it. Let's be careful. That's fine. And then a lot of people from day one said, "Oh, it's not even real." I was fine, just like what Claire said. When something's new, you have to be careful, and until we find out exactly what the threat is. And I think that was the UK government's approach at the beginning as well. Instead of completely ignoring it or completely going all out, let's just bring down everything and just have a full lockdown. That's not what they wanted. Sage and the Downing Street were taking their time, and they actually got criticised for that. The issue I have is that, again, Claire said this. This has become so political. I thought when the pandemic started, this would be the one topic after Brexit and everything else that people aren't going to be turning it into a tribal battle. Whether you're pro or against it, it's not even about everyone becoming a health expert either. But it's become so difficult that when you have, as a YouTuber, for the first month or so, YouTube essentially banned people from talking about it. Your videos would either be removed or demonetized. They eventually decided to take a softer approach and say, okay, you can mention the word, but don't just say that it's a hoax. But it's also about free speech. Essentially, we don't want to spread fake news or something that's not real. But when you have corporations, institutions, also governments, and public health bodies essentially censoring people, say we can't have a debate about this, that made it difficult, and that's why a chunk of society and across the world have become even more skeptical because they weren't able to talk before. So you have all these anti-lockdown protests that I've been going to. A lot of people are there because they don't want a full lockdown. They're kind of afraid of the consequences. And some people have become so obviously extreme to the other side and say, this is obviously like Bill Gates created it to do it on purpose. This happens. And I think that the fact that it's become political, that's the problem. Obviously, you guys mentioned in terms of the issues around the virus itself. Is it a killer? Is it, we know that transmission is a big issue with this virus.
Well, it's definitely a killer, right? It's definitely a killer.
Oh yeah, I mean, about a serial killer or I don't know, as killer as the others. It's definitely, again, it really depends on who you are as a person and your conditions. But those who say that it's definitely nothing, it's not even a flu, that's wrong. And those who are going and treating it as if it's turning everyone into a zombie, that's also wrong. So I think that there's no middle ground in the sense. You have, again, people like Professor Sikora and a number of others, Gupta and everyone, who have been shut down. They were outspoken on Twitter, for example, and their own blogs. But governments across the world haven't been listening to these people. So you either have the outspoken people like Piers Corbyn on the one side, or you have Sage or your Chris Whittiers and Balance saying that you have to listen to us and you can't question what we do. And I think that's been the biggest problem with the pandemic.
Claire, I want to come back to you for your final thoughts before I let you leave. And I want to pick up a couple of threads that you were touching on earlier. One was about the way that interventionist, anti-liberal legislation is passed in haste. I mean, obviously the Coronavirus Act, rattled through in 24, 48 hours and repented at leisure. But also I'm interested in, so do you think it will take years to get back to where we were because some alternative rationale will be found for keeping some of these restrictions in place? They'll be found to be generally helpful to state authorities, even if COVID-19 has been completely cured. And secondly, Claire, I'm interested because you always highlight the cultural aspects here. How degrading to our culture of freedom do you think this has been? I'll share with you an anecdote. It doesn't prove a point, but I was speaking to a friend of mine who invited her mother to come down to London. And her mother didn't want to come down to London. And that wasn't because it would mean that she would have to wear a mask. And it wasn't because she was terrified about the risk of infection. It was because she was terrified she would get the rules wrong, that she wouldn't wear her mask at the right time, or she'd be shouted at if she got onto the bus through the wrong entrance or the wrong exit, or, forgot to put her mask on as she went to the bathroom or something. And so her reason for not coming and seeing her daughter in London was fear that she would not understand and interpret the rules. Nothing to do with the virus and nothing to do with being some arch libertarian who refuses to wear a mask. Do you think we're actually seeing our culture diminish and people aren't going to express themselves and are now cowed in various ways because of the rules and regulations here, even if they're having a public health benefit? Claire, let me have your thoughts on that before I wish you a good evening.
Sorry, I won't dwell on the legislation because to a certain extent the jury's out, except to say that I don't think that I don't see this as a government power grab, on the way to authoritarianism. I think it's, however, careless and complacent about the importance of civil liberties, if you see what I mean. So I don't think they've consciously gone out to say, oh yeah, totalitarian, here we come. I actually believe Boris when he says, well, I believe in freedom, I blah, blah, blah. It's sort of like in his head. But the problem is that the legislation nonetheless frames the way that we live our lives and the ease with which they brought it in. And the rule of 6 was the one that did me in. You know what I mean? It's like sort of 6. Why 6? Why not 8, 10, 4? I mean, God. And that it just gets announced. You talk about the anecdote about somebody coming down to London. I'm seriously, because I'm moving between London and Chester, and I'm basically saying I'm meeting somebody tomorrow. And I've worked out how to meet in the pub car park now. And I'm literally reading the stuff saying, oh, we're tier 2. What does that mean? Where are we allowed to meet? Who are we allowed to? I just think my life, what? This is the micromanagement. See, one thing about an overall lockdown is you all get treated the same and you just kind of get on with it. This is the micromanagement of where you are particularly and how many people you can meet and how long you can be with them and all the rest of it. Frightens me. Culturally then, just to finish, I fear that people have had the stuffing knocked out of them, in a variety of ways. So, when you think that the most recent big political climate that we had got through was taking back control, that was the slogan, taking back control, an assertion of autonomy and self-determination, an attempt at saying that we will be able to hold politicians accountable for laws rather than far over in Brussels. If we remember that, not that long, we're still in the midst of the Brexit thing, but that was the kind of mood. And now I'm afraid that you have a climate in which people demand to be protected and demand to have the rules spelt out for them and have lost confidence in their capacity. So Mark, when you were asking earlier, when you were asking Ben, and of course it's my approach as well, why don't we trust people? But the problem is if you infantilize everybody so much, then you lose confidence because you suddenly think, well, am I allowed to do that? The fact that we even ask, am I allowed to have, my mate round? It means that we aren't living in a free society. And my greatest fear is that the new normal, which I also hate, will be a less free society, because about freedom is you have to live it. It's not just an abstract thing. You have to live freedom. It's a habit. And if you lose the habit of living as a free citizen, that has catastrophic impact. So for those of us who are freedom lovers, I don't call myself a libertarian, but whatever one, just believe in free individuals, I think what we're going to have to do is to find ways of repopularizing what being a free individual means. And we thought it was a kind of joke. Mark, God, how often have we done it? They're stopping us smoking. There's a nanny state there telling you how much to drink and how much to eat. Who'd have thought that we would have as mainstream approach? Having said all of that, it's also true that humanity has, the whole history of of modern times has been the fight for freedom. When people have their freedoms restricted, at some stage it gives. And I don't mean people are going to all take the streets. What I mean is that sense, that stifling sense of not being free, I think we need to appeal to intellectually at first, and then we might stand a chance because we haven't given up on it, but the cause for freedom has been set back. Let's put it that way.
Well, Claire, thank you very much for joining us. It's over to you now. Now you're clad in ermine and one of our great legislators. I'm looking to you to protect our freedom. But I think the point you make is is really apposite. Freedom isn't just something written on the statute book. It's something that you've got to feel in your soul if it's going to survive. Claire, thank you very much for joining us. Good luck with your great fun in the pub car park with your friends. Stay safe, stay free. Maya and Andrew, stay with us. I'm going to ask two more guests to join us. It's welcome back to the show, both to Benedict Spence, who writes regularly for the Telegraph and the Independent, covering virtually every topic under the sun, and our very own Chris Snowdon. Welcome back to the channel for him. Good evening, Chris.
Good evening.
Chris, let me come to you. Where have you got to on? And good evening, Benedict. I can see you now. Welcome, welcome, welcome. Chris, where have you got to on the lockdown thing? I think you were a little like me initially, that you were sympathetic to the government taking some action. You weren't a kind of completely purist libertarian with a tinfoil hat in your shed. But have you run out of sympathy now?
Yeah. And as you say, I've been the voice of the sensible middle ground throughout this, Mark. But I've run out of patience a long time ago, quite honestly. I think the lockdown went on far too long. And in hindsight, even more than at the time, I think that was a really big mistake. Because you have to assume that the rise in cases we've seen recently is primarily a result of people not following the rules, right? If people have been following the rules and we're still getting 15,000 cases, then we might as well just give up on it now. People are not following the rules. Why aren't they following the rules? Well, I think partly because people have cottoned on to some of the stuff you were saying earlier, that, you know, for the majority of people, it's just simply no risk to them at all. But given that people do understand that that has knock-on effects, I think it's primarily frustration. I think people are sick of it. I think they locked us up for far too long, quite unnecessarily, during a very hot summer when I don't think the virus realistically was going to circulate very much. They pushed us with so many stupid, petty regulations, not least this 10 p.m. closing time, which has been counterproductive as far as I can see. And I'm afraid people's patience has run out. You compare that to, I'm going to mention Sweden, but I made no apologies for it. You compare it to Sweden. Sweden didn't have a herd immunity approach, contrary to what people believe. They had an approach that people could live with. That was what they said from day one. We want to give people rules that do involve changing their lifestyles, but that they can follow for 1, 2, 3 years potentially. So they only have a 7-day self-isolation, for example, with the test and trace, because they think, probably rightly, that people just aren't going to put up with 14 days. It seems too long. It is too long, really, realistically. And they've given people rules that they can go along with. In the case of Britain, we were given far too stringent rules, a far too lengthy lockdown, quite unnecessarily. People started to see through the whole thing. And now a large proportion of the population really just don't care anymore.
Okay, well, I want to come on to that. I want to come on to the economic side of it. Closing time, we're calling this section, because vast swathes of the economy, well, I say vast swathes, I mean identifiable parts of the economy, basically are not being allowed to function. Pubs, restaurants, casinos, bookmakers, gyms, football clubs under threat. There's been an awful lot about football recently, whether you're going to have to bail out most football teams because they can't get fans into the stadium. How deep is the economic scarring going to be? And Benedict, let me come to you before I bring in our previous guests here. We sort of have the government saying, well, we're bringing the furlough scheme. That will act as a bridge for jobs that are viable, but not viable over this short lockdown period. You know, we're not going to let pubs serve beer or have customers. We're not going to let football clubs play in front of crowds. But now we're only going to give support, if you like, to jobs that are viable. But a good number of these jobs in the hospitality and entertainment sector are simply not viable because of the rules. I mean, it's a sort of catch-22. You can't. How on earth are you supposed to run a business if you're in any of these sectors whilst these restrictions remain in place? And so, Benedict, my question to you is, how deep is this scarring going to be on these sectors that are the most hit? You know, a think tank can more or less go about its ordinary business, but a pub, a restaurant, or a football team can't. Are we actually going to kill off these industries because lockdown has now been so long?
I mean, the football example is a very interesting one because an awful lot of football clubs lower down the football pyramid were already struggling for myriad reasons, you know, as much as anything else, you know, sort of shifting tastes, preference for upper tier football, I suppose, and that sort of breakdown in the community links was seeing gate receipts going down. But they were viable. A lot of these clubs were still viable businesses, and I suppose that's the thing, is that a lot of them would have turned around and said, "Well, we're still hopeful that we can turn things around and sort of reverse that trend anyway." And I think that's probably the case. For a lot of businesses in the hospitality sector, is that a lot of them would have turned around to you and gone, well, regardless of how things were going, we were optimistic that things could always improve if sort of left to their own devices. One of the things I think is really worrying about this, I remember Claire mentioned the new normal just before she left. And that is actually how much, the longer we're in lockdown, how much will people's attitudes, behaviors, how much will they permanently change? And I think, just to look at football, for example, I mean, we're already getting to the point where far fewer younger people are going to games, at the local teams and that sort of thing, because they can watch sort of elite level football on the television, but also things like video gaming, things like FIFA have got huge corners of the entertainment market that once upon a time would have been taken by football. Now, football's an industry, it's a very progressive industry, it's also a very competitive industry like any others. I suppose the free marketeer in you might go, well, some of these clubs do need to die, there isn't a market for them anyway. But you sort of wonder, actually, the longer that people are more accustomed to staying inside, less likely to go out, and also more sort of hammered down by the general pervasive attitude of fear. When lockdown does end, will that sort of, because we don't actually know how much longer this is going to go on for. They're saying 2-3 weeks. We all remember that lasted 4 months last time. And it's that sort of situation where you're thinking, well, if it's another 3-4 months and we miss another season of the football, will those links to businesses, not just football clubs, but to other businesses, will they just be severed entirely? Will people just completely get out of the habit of going out in the evening to a restaurant, to a bar, if they can get everything delivered? Will Zoom calls and things like that become the norm to the point that people begin to think, do you know what, actually, I don't really feel like going out to socialize? Because this is the other thing, people are beginning to say, with some justification, we're going to have to live with this virus.
Yep.
How much are people going to be prepared to live with the virus, or will they try to avoid, as it were, living for fear of the virus? And that's the thing that worries me going forward.
Mahyar, let me come back to you, because I need someone to help me with what the rules are here, or to try and make some sense of them. When this show ends in about 15-20 minutes time, I'm going to pop across the road to a restaurant that I suspect will be full. I'm going to have dinner with 5 other people who will be sitting, I don't know, a metre away from me. I have to wear a mask while I walk to the table, but as soon as there's water at the table, I can take my mask off. I think I have to put my mask on again if I go to the bathroom. But I can't go to St Mary's Stadium to watch Southampton Football Club at all. A 32,000 seater open air stadium, where I can appreciate you might not be able to get in 32,000 people, but I would have thought you can get 5,000 or 6,000 in with social distancing. Do you think, Mahyar, that the put aside, if you like, the question of whether there should be some restrictions, what do you make of the apparent anomalies in the restrictions, that you can do X, which on the face of it is quite dangerous, but you can't do Y, which on the face of it is much less dangerous?
We can spend the whole night analyzing, and on questioning the logic behind these tiny measures. We've talked about this tonight, how at the beginning with the full lockdown, it was simpler and a lot of people were sympathetic. It's going to affect everyone equally, essentially. Whereas these ones, especially with the rule of 6, the number 6 came from the cabinet. It wasn't really scientific. It could have been 8, could have been 7. And even the 10 p.m. curfew, a lot of scientific advice was against it. But it's not even about any of this, because it's so complicated. And what the whole situation is doing is it's creating this cultural shift. The reason, just before she left, Claire was mentioning freedom and how much, how we appreciate freedom and what happens when we lose it. And I've said this a lot of times. As you guys know, my background is Persian. I was born in Iran, and those, like a country like Iran after the revolution, when dictatorship came and all these measures that took away your freedoms, every single time authoritarian comes in, it comes in with a certain message. We're doing it for the public good. It's for the public interest, and it's not just like, oh, we're evil. We are publicly saying we're evil. And what it does is you're going to create a part of society that become rebellious. Part of the other part become they just become so defeatist, and the same thing is happening. So hospitality and all the other sectors that we are they're facing a crisis at the moment. it's not just about the jobs and the salaries that are obviously facing threats at this moment. That's very important, obviously, but there's also a long-term consequence. So we have traditional conservatives, and you have the socialists who have always been against progress and technology, saying that if these things come in, we're going to lose our certain old school kind of sectors, like the Hackney carriages when black cabs came, and now obviously Uber's coming, black cabs are kicking off, and all the other technologies. These are the same people who are now enforcing and are defending these policies that will definitely change our lifestyles. So yes, working from home is fine. A lot of companies could do it, but as Benedict said as well, it's also affecting obviously high street shops. It's affecting obviously the restaurants and pubs. Again, the local football clubs, people really don't go there to kind of see them anymore because they just watch Sky Sports for free. And the difference is, as a libertarian, I'm always in favor of change and progress if it's in favor of obviously society. But this is different. So the change that we're seeing, this kind of technology of work from home and use Zoom, it's not natural. It's not a natural change because it's by force. It's affecting the economic side. It's affecting psychologically. People are so confused about, as you said, going to restaurants and all these things. So I think the consequences will be long term, and I think the faith and trust in politics and the political class is going to go lower than before.
Yeah, I think it's extraordinary. I mean, I can't go to Stamford Bridge on Saturday to watch Chelsea thrash Southampton. But I can go down the pub, which will be absolutely heaving, in order to watch it on a television screen in the pub, watch Chelsea thrash Southampton. Andrew, where do you think we've got to on the rules? I mean, let me play devil's advocate here and show some sympathy for the government. Is you can't get it precisely right. There's not a scientific answer about whether it should be a rule of 6, a rule of 8, or a rule of 10. You've got to kind of draw a line somewhere to just generally try and stop the spread. You've got to make a number of arbitrary decisions. But do you think we've actually got into a situation in which it's impossible to know what the rules are? And even if you do know what they are, they seem to be so contradictory. Again, why can I do X, but I can't do Y? And the minute you see all of these internal contradictions, one's willingness to comply goes down, frankly.
Yeah, well, as Claire said earlier, the rule of 6 really did it for me as well. And the fact that it also includes children. So you could have 2-week-old twin babies who are still part of that rule of 6. That's a total nonsense. I was looking at some of the restrictions earlier today. If you're in a tier 1 area, which I am, there are 19 exceptions to the rules that they've already laid out. If you happen to be in the highest level, the tier 3, then there are 21 exceptions to the rules that have already been laid out. And this is in addition to the many rules that have already been put in place in local lockdowns. So, for example, my mother, she lives in County Durham. She's 79 years old. Her younger sister, who's 70, has sadly got cancer. She can't see her at all. So she's been completely blocked from doing that. Can't even go outside in the garden. I think I can actually drive up there with my family so she can see her little grandson. But I think we can sort of walk through a park. I think we can walk through a park and socially distance, but I'm not absolutely certain. I certainly know that we're not allowed to mingle. So, I mean, all these rules are just enormously complex, and it's going to get worse.
Yep. Chris, let me come back to you, particularly your whole area of research for the IA is around pleasure and prohibition. On the 10 p.m. curfew point, I should say that's why this episode of Live at Littlewood's cut short a bit, because I need to go out for dinner and they'll lock everything down at 9:45. What do you make of it? Do you think we've now got politicians in charge of this thing who simply can't program in any dynamic effects, right? The idea was, well, if people aren't in pubs between 10 and 11, then there will be a lower risk of transmission. But they don't build into that everybody then pulls out onto the streets at 10 or holds a house party at 10:05 or whatever else. I mean, it seems to actually be something which isn't balancing off a loss of freedom for public health benefit. It's a loss of freedom that might actually be exacerbating public health problems. Is that right?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, the first weekend of the 10 p.m. closing time, I went out a bit earlier than normal. I went out about 6 o'clock because I knew I was going to have to leave early, and I fully intended to come home at 10 o'clock. But of course, once I'd finished, a few people said we're going to go back to the house, have a few more drinks. So I went around to someone's house till 1 p.m. So there's only 6 of us, to be fair, and no one's got the Rona as a result. But you can see how that can be multiplied around the entire country. It's pretty obvious. There isn't a lot of evidence in this area. That's the thing. There isn't any empirical evidence really about so many of the things we're facing now because we're in uncharted territory. And that's why Chris Whitty has to resort to appalling junk science passed around MPs in private. But you can sympathize because there's no peer-reviewed stuff out there. But a lot of it's just common sense, And it's obvious to anybody who goes out at all that people aren't going to go to bed at 10 p.m. They're going to go back with their friends to an unregulated environment with no social distancing and probably more than 6 people. I think the 10 p.m. curfew has almost certainly been counterproductive. And it comes back a bit to what I was saying before. Give people rules that they can comprehend, follow, and sympathize with. The 10 p.m. thing was, I think, the straw that broke the camel's back for a lot of people. It's almost certainly been counterproductive. Again, I can't prove that. There's no empirical evidence here. It's common sense. But did you see what Matt Hancock said in the House of Commons yesterday when this was put to him? He said, well, we've seen fewer fights in the street. There's fewer people being admitted late at night to A&E, and this proves that people are not mixing as much late at night. I mean, come on. Yeah. These people, we're being run by people who've been driven insane, in my opinion.
Benedict, let me come back to you. Do you think that people will also? I mean, that's the danger, right? That the thing will be brought in on public health grounds, and then the government will retain it on the grounds that it stops riotous behaviour in the streets. But the favourite staff request I have received in my 10 years at the IEA was a staff member of mine who will remain anonymous, although I'll say it wasn't Chris, who said, Mark, given that the pubs and restaurants now close at 10 o'clock, not at 11 o'clock, is there any chance you could change the working day to make it 8 a.m. to 4 p.m. rather than 9 a.m. to 5 p.m. or just find a way to work around it? Benedict, what do you make of this 10 p.m. curfew? And surely to God, this is going to come to an end, isn't it?
I mean, there are a few times.
Benedict's going a bit scratchy there, I think. We're having some trouble getting you, Benedict. Mahyar, let me come to you.
Really was.
Mahyar, let me come to you. Do you think, as a libertarian-minded person, people will find ways around it? This ingenious thing will just switch the working day earlier, right? Get into the office earlier, go down the pub between 4 and 10 rather than 5 and 11.
Yeah, but to be you're going to have a group of people who are going to find loopholes on purpose. Again, just like any other historic example we have in any country, where people, if they want to do something, they'll do it. That's one part. The other parts of what they'll do is they'll make mistakes, let's just say, or against the measure accidentally. They'll turn up to the pub slightly earlier, or they'll stay till 10 p.m. The issue is that there are more people out at 10 p.m. than 2 a.m. And obviously, if everyone leaves, everyone goes on the street. Everyone goes to the tube station or train stations at the same time. So you're going to have the proactive, rebellious side, just like we saw last night in Liverpool on the streets with the young people. Actually, they did it on purpose. That was definitely on purpose, just to show their anger. Not saying if it was right or wrong. That's irrelevant. It's just that's one side. Then you got the other side who accidentally fall into it. They just happen to stay in the pub till 10, and they now have to go. They will have to get the same train, and they're probably part of the group who are very, very scared of the pandemic and these situations, but now they have to mingle with everybody else. So it's affecting everyone at the same time. It's idiotic. There was nothing behind it. And I am hoping, as you said, Mark, that they would change this specific policy soon. But the problem is when you have people like Matt Hancock and others who are so arrogant at the top, that they just can't admit that this was a mistake. So instead of completely scrapping it, they're probably going to come up with an excuse to ease it and say, oh, we're just replacing it with something better because times have changed over the last 24 hours. So they will definitely have to make a U-turn, but they can't. He would never come out, Hancock, to say, sorry, hands up, that was a wrong decision. And that's the problem we have with the political system right now.
Mahyar, I know you've got to leave us. Lovely to see you, with the full glory of your Union Jack behind you. Yours is bigger than Andrew's, by the way.
Size
We're
matters.
going to have to, have a race to the top here. Mahyar, lovely to see you. Andrew and Chris stay with us. I think we might have Benedict back online. I just want to finish with a slightly different topic, but one I found interesting. We're calling this Lost Generation. This is some new figures from the Office of National Statistics. And they seem to show that young, I underscore that, white people in Britain now earn less than their BAME counterparts. So the ethnic pay gap has vanished, or rather has gone in the other direction for those who began their careers in the last 15 years. Yesterday, the Commons Education Committee examined the educational underachievement of white pupils from disadvantaged backgrounds, an issue that increasingly animates both the Select Committee Chairman, Rob Halforn, and some of the newer intake of Tory MPs. Chris, you've written for The Spectator, I think it was back in July. You wrote an article called The Lost Boys, the Forgotten Demographic. It seems we might actually have a problem here that goes against the Black Lives Matter narrative, right? That and here are some statistics for you. In the 16 to 29 age group in England and Wales, ethnic minorities earned 5.5% more in 2019 than young white Brits. Young white Brits earned £9.82 an hour on average, compared to £14.29 an hour earned by young Chinese employees, or £12.10 an hour earned by young Arab workers. For all ages, whites still earn more than ethnic minorities, 2.3%, down from 5.1% in 2012. Overall, the workers of Chinese and Indian descent out-earn white British workers by almost £10,000 a year. White free school meal eligible pupils are half as likely as their peers to achieve a strong pass in 8 GCSEs. It seems the white working class might be the left behind demographic here. I'm not trying to hand wave away problems of racism in other parts of society, but perhaps we should be spending a bit more focus on this. What do you think, Chris?
Yeah, I mean, that's exactly what I said in my article called The Lost Boys, which is presumably online somewhere on the website of The Spectator. I think the primary thing is boosting educational standards in the left behind areas. There's been a huge amount of money and effort put into inner London in particular, where obviously you have very large immigrant populations. And that seems to be incredibly successful, remarkably high levels of university entrance in inner city London. But the other thing I think is, and you and I, Mark, and the IEA, we often talk about the gender pay gap, and these simple figures can often be a bit misleading. I think the interesting thing about the figures is it's not just white working class or white British at the bottom of the pile. There's a huge variation between, for example, Pakistanis and Indians. Indians earning quite a bit more than white British, Pakistanis quite a bit less, Chinese earning a hugely amount more. I think my take home from it is, let's not blame racism for racial gaps in pay. I mean, it doesn't make any sense. It's a very, very specific kind of racism that discriminates against Pakistanis but not Indians, and against white British and not Chinese people.
Yeah. Benedict, I think we've got you back. I hope so. What do you make about this of the white working class being left behind? White working classes, people are the group least likely to go to university after the traveller community. Just 13% of white working class boys will attend university. Ben Bradley, who was on the show earlier, says statistically working class white boys, are the least likely to get good qualifications, the least likely to go to university, the most likely to commit suicide. The rapper Stormzy was praised for starting a scholarship for poor black students to go to Cambridge every year. When a similar scholarship was made available by Sir Brian Thwaites for poor white boys to go to private schools, his £1 million offer was rejected by every single school he approached. What are we to make of this? Have we misunderstood who the left behind really are, Benedict?
I mean, partly why my internet connection is so bad is that I'm originally from and currently in rural East Anglia, where it's one of those parts of the world where, as Chris said, you can look at how much money has been sort of pumped into inner city schools in parts of London. When we think about the white working class, I think there's a view, an attitude in London that the working class that aren't in London are all sort of in northern post-industrial towns, and that everybody is wearing a flat cap. But actually, this as much applies to sort of rural areas like this. that really are left behind. Now, my mother's a teacher. She teaches in a secondary school in rural Suffolk. There is absolutely no expectation and it is especially white boys, to go to university. There's very little pressure. There's very little sort of history within their families of anybody sort of aspiring to that, because it's expected that they'll work on the land nearby me. There's a print works that a lot of people go and work in. They will earn minimum wage and that sort of thing. And that's sort of the expectation. There's no great sort of push and very little attention paid to people in those sort of circumstances. And I think when you bear that in mind, you've got sort of generation after generation. If you go around, the sort of the local town halls, you look at the names of the families, they've been here for centuries, in some cases thousands of years, and they're continuing to do what they've always done. Very little people sort of in London care about them. There's not much sort of raised about it as an issue. And then I think if you sort of juxtapose that with the nature of migrant communities, they do very much sort of tend to be, upstart is the wrong word. There's a desire to get on. There's a desire to do better, and there's an expectation that parents who have moved from poorer countries, from poorer situations, and have sacrificed a lot. There is an expectation that their children will work a lot harder. There's a lot more, both from the schools, but also from the parents themselves, sort of pushing people towards, sort of aspirational careers. And I think we see that reflected now in, everything from sort of medicine to the law. In a staggering amount of young people in graduate programs today are from ethnic minority backgrounds. They are from migrant communities. And I don't think there's anything wrong with that, per se. But I do think that it's sort of very interesting how everything is sort of framed as this country sort of holds people back, who come from sort of migrant communities. The very fact that so many of them work in menial jobs at the bottom when they start out, that this is some sort of a problem. And I don't think it's that at all. I think that just by their very nature, there's a lot more ambition, there's a lot more drive. And I just think ultimately, as Chris has written about, you do just get this sort of entire subset of people who live in urban communities, post-industrial communities, but also rural communities, who are just sort of very much taken for granted because they don't necessarily kick up much of a fuss. Their votes don't tend, until recently, their votes never really tended to change very much. And these were not the people aspiring to get into politics to change something. So I think a lot of it comes down to the fact that by the very nature, migrant communities are aspirational in a way that I'm not saying that a lot of working class communities aren't, but just very much less attention and less expectation is placed on them.
Andrew, let me give the last word to you. What do you make of this? And to some degree, I'm conscious. Claire Fox's words are ringing in my ear. She said earlier, there's a danger on the freedom of speech issue that you just get a sort of tit for tat. That Remainers target Darren Grimes, and then Brexiteers target Navarro media. And I worry that might happen in identity politics as well, right? That you get kind of, well, this group's disadvantaged, and then there's, oh, no, actually that group's disadvantaged. And but nevertheless, some of the statistics here suggest we might have misunderstood disadvantage insofar as it plays into identity, race, or class background. Do you think that might be true?
Well, I'm sitting in my office here in Beverley in East Yorkshire, and the city of Hull is just a few miles down the road. And I remember a headline in the local newspaper, the Hull Daily Mail, something like 20 years ago, that said, "Why do people in the city not value education?" And it seemed to be a generational thing in the city of Hull, where that the parents never really valued education, never went to school, but they got that from their parents, and they got that from the parents before. And they've always voted Labour, and it still is very much a Labour city. So there was never a big incentive to change anything. Yeah, education has improved in the city, but I don't think it's improved by huge jumps at all. And I very much agree with what Benedict said. These are the sort of people who don't really kick up a fuss. But what going back to what your question was, Mark. I don't want to go around playing the blame game in all of this. It's like when someone attacks me, and I'm thinking, oh, well, should I report them to the police? Well, no, because I believe in free speech, and I believe.
Well, if they literally attack you, you might. If they verbally attacked you, that you wouldn't report them.
Well, literally. Yeah. Well, yes, I get called that I'm very far hard right. That was a really good one. Very far hard right. But I don't want to go down that blame game route at all. But it is very worrying. I mean, I remember Philip Davis when he was wanting to have a debate on men's issues, and Jess Phillips just laughed at him and said, well, how many men are there in here? And then he went through the whole list. Biggest killer of men under 40 is suicide. And this is in typical sort of working class areas. So it is worrying. We do have to do everything that we can to try and rectify it.
Gentlemen, thanks for helping us navigate these choppy, controversial waters. Been an absolute pleasure having you with us, Chris and Ben, on the show again. Andrew, your first time on the show. We look forward to welcoming you back very, very, very soon. My thanks to our earlier guests as well, Mahyar Tousi, Ben Bradley MP, and Baroness Fox of Buckley. It was great to have them. Live with Littlewood will be back next week. Keep your eyes out for the exact time and date. If you've enjoyed the show and you're watching us on YouTube, please hit the thumbs up button. Please also subscribe if you haven't already. We're on the march to 10,000 subscribers, so hit the subscribe button and the notification bell. That will mean that if your notifications are switched on, you get to know exactly when our upcoming shows are happening. Special thanks to our donors. If you can help us financially in any way at all, you can find details on how to donate to us on the IEA website, iea.org.uk. And I'll just leave you with an anecdote. These are dismal days for the hospitality sector and the pub sector, but I've got a story that might just cheer you up. It's one of epic trolling. Tim Martin, the founder of the Wetherspoons pub chain, he's a good friend of the IEA, and I once asked him how he came up with the name Wetherspoons, and it turns out that he was told by his history teacher at school that he, Tim Martin, would never really amount to very much. The name of the teacher who slapped him down at school and said that he wouldn't amount to very much, Mr. Wetherspoon. Possibly the most epic act of trolling ever. Revenge is indeed a glass served cold as a nice cold beer. So cheers to everybody. Thank you for joining us. Hit the like button. Remember to subscribe. We'll see you next week to help navigate our way through all of these crises yet again. It's been a great pleasure hosting you all, gentlemen. Speak to you soon. Over and out.